Well, hey there, Vineyard folks. It is so good to be with you again this morning or afternoon or evening or middle of the night or whenever you happen to be watching this. And hey, shout out to all students and teachers and professors and administrators and other educational support staff that are back at school already or going back in the next few weeks. We just want to bless you this school year with all the flexibility and perseverance and wisdom that you're going to need to have a wonderful year as you re-engage the high calling of helping students to learn, which is an apropos segue to what I want to talk about in this teaching. And it comes in our continuing series, Living Questionable Lives. This is a series where we're asking, how do we foster or how do we nurture a thoroughly Jesus-centric, Jesus-saturated lifestyle that will truly be questionable, that will by nature raise eyebrows or curiosity and cause people to ask questions about, I don't know, hope in the midst of despair, or peace in the midst of chaos, or joy in the midst of pain. Because, communities of people that build their lives around the life and teachings, or what we've called the way of Jesus, we see this expressed to us in the Sermon on the Mount, they've always provoked curiosity as to why they're so different. This was true, as we've already talked about in this series, in the 4th century Roman Empire, and it's also true today in the 21st century across the world as the kingdom of God moves forward. And so we're spending this month looking at 5 habits that we believe will help to release some of our core values like generosity and hospitality and being Spirit-led. And so we talked about blessing others to foster generosity. And we talked about eating with others to nurture hospitality. And then last week, Abigail, she encouraged us to listen to the Spirit of God and to listen to others if we're truly going to be Spirit-led. Well, today I want to engage habit number 4. And it goes back to where we began just a minute ago, blessing a new school year that's upon us, because the habit that we're going to focus on today is in fact the habit of learning. But this is a very specific kind of learning, because it's rooted in a curious way that Paul talks about the difference between life before and life after beginning to follow Jesus. And it actually comes to us in a letter to a church in a Roman colony called Ephesus. You'd find it in modern-day Turkey. It's a letter aptly called Ephesians. And right in the middle of the letter, Paul is encouraging this young church to reject the futile way of life that the world offers. And here's how he describes people who live this way. In Ephesians chapter 4, I'm going to start in verse 18. He writes this: "They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of their ignorance and hardness of heart. They have lost all sensitivity and have abandoned themselves to licentiousness, greedy to practice every kind of impurity." So Paul acknowledges that, some choose to live this way, and elsewhere he talks about this way as kind of a dead-end kind of way. And it's a way that eventually ends in, destruction and disillusionment and pain. But then in the very next verse, he begins talking about an entirely different way of living, an entirely different way to orient our lives. Listen to how he begins. In Ephesians 4, verse 20, he says, "That is not the way you learned Christ." Now that's a curious way to talk about learning, isn't it? Learning Christ? We talk a lot about believing in Christ or even worshiping Christ as Lord, but learning him? What does it mean to learn Christ? Because that's what Paul says the Ephesians have done. He says they've apparently learned Christ. And apparently that's what makes them a different kind of people, living a different kind of way in the midst of those who he says are just hard-hearted or who have given themselves over to greed and the like. And so this morning, I want to encourage you and I to adopt this same habit of learning Christ. Which again begs the question, what does that even mean? In Paul's day, and continuing throughout the early church history, To learn Christ, it was apparently a fairly common expression. It was a way to talk about what happened to a person as they came out of one way of living and exchanged it for another. It was a way to talk about what we might call conversion. And that included, amongst other things, the complete renunciation of all other pagan gods. But conversion was far more than just saying no to certain things. It also meant that you were saying yes to something much, much greater. And this involved what was called catechism, or a season or a period of committed learning and study. Now, I know that some of you may be familiar with that term, catechism, especially, I don't know if you were raised in the Catholic Church or a more high church setting. If you were raised Vineyard, dare I say, that is not probably a familiar term in your vernacular. But here's the thing. For the first Christians, this season or this period of catechism, it was for the express purpose of committing oneself to an intensive study of the life and the teachings of Jesus. Or you could say it was a season to learn Christ. And it stands to reason that if you and I are going to become more Christ-like, if we're going to reflect and embody the life and the teachings or the way of Jesus, then we need to know what that way is and what that way looks like. Now, a good place to start, of course, that would be the Sermon on the Mount, which is why we spent the first 7 months of this year there. And so I encourage you, keep going back to that sermon in Matthew 5 through 7. It's the roadmap. It's the playbook. It's what it looks like to immerse yourselves in the life of Jesus. It's perhaps the best place that we can continue to go to, in fact, learn Christ. And I guarantee you this, that if you and I center who we are and how we respond to the world around us from that place, there is no way we will not live questionable lives. Because it's just such a different way to live. And that's always been the case. And this is why a church like Vineyard Church Glendora, this is why we exist. You could say it's our mission to invite people to enter into this thoroughly Jesus-centric, Jesus-saturated way of living, which Jesus promised is truly the abundant or the full life. In his classic book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says what I just said a bit more poignantly. He writes this: in the same way, the church exists for nothing else but to draw people into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. So tell us what you really think, Clive Staples Lewis. Lewis here, he's promoting what I would call a preoccupation with the example and the teachings of Jesus for the express purpose of emulation by his followers, so that we will truly live as he lived and do as he did. And the older I get and the longer I'm a part of a church like this one, that's just where I'm at. I've developed what I think is a healthy preoccupation with simply wanting to keep it about being like Jesus in every way possible, learning Christ and living that way. And so as we look at how Jesus extended kindness and compassion, we ask, how can we do the same? And as we look at how Jesus lived sacrificially and gave his life for the sake of the world, we ask, how do we offer our lives sacrificially for the sake of the world? For our communities, our cities, our neighbors. How do we do this as a church? And how does the church become, quite literally, the offering to the world? And then if we step back a little bit, and we step back even further, and we look at how Jesus engaged people, we find this consistent thread from beginning to end in the Gospels. And it was this: he was present and he came near. The more sophisticated word for this, it's incarnation. That quite literally all of God came near, broken humanity, in flesh and bones and blood through Jesus. John famously says it this way. In John chapter 1, verse 14, he writes, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Now, other ways, made his dwelling among us, has been translated or or understood include lived among us, or dwelt among us, or made his home among us, or took up residence among us, or tabernacled, pitched his tent, and literally set up camp, among us. And so the way of Jesus, it's an embodied, incarnational, flesh and blood, near, present way that comes close and sets up camp and lives among and alongside broken humanity. Now, if you start there and you read the rest of the Gospels through that lens, you see it everywhere. You see it at a well on the outskirts of a town as he came near a Samaritan woman. You see it on a dusty road as he came near an ostracized leper, or on a crowded street where he showed kindness and compassion to a single woman who'd been bleeding for many years. Jesus, as the Christ, consistently was present and came near and dwelled alongside human brokenness. And if we're going to pattern our lives and our church after this example, we must do the same. You know, one of Jesus' disciples said it this way in his first letter when he was talking about how to live differently in a pagan society. It's in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. He says this: "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." Following Jesus' example. Literally, Peter writes, in his steps, or perhaps we could say, learning Christ. This is what we're called to, Peter says, and you know, as we give ourselves to that calling, we trust that as a byproduct, we'll become more Christ-like. And you know, once again, this is the motivation and the driving force behind our vision in this season to develop this space called the Vineyard Co-Gather. We see this as a practical way to come near and be a healing presence in our community, to dwell with and among people like Jesus, to be Christ-like among the people in an incarnational, flesh and blood kind of way. We see the Co-Gather as a place where all who enter can experience the kindness and the compassion of Jesus. We see the Co-Gather as quite literally an offering to the community. And yes, it will require sacrifice, because that's just how offerings work. We see the Co-Gather as a place where we follow in Jesus' steps, even as we continue to learn Christ. You know, last Friday we had an amazing evening as we pitched a bunch of tents. So many of you showed up. I guess they were easy-ups, right there in the parking lot on the corner of Arrow and Bonnie Cove. And we invited the neighborhood just to the north to join us that night for Kona Ice and an outdoor movie night. It was our first attempt to just bless and eat with and listen to our neighbors, which are the first three habits, by the way. We simply were attempting to show kindness and be an offering to the neighborhood. It was our first attempt to really connect and be among the people. And let me tell you, it was glorious. And as we reflected on the event later that night, one of my first thoughts was, this is what a porous boundary between the church and community could look like. And as a fairly steady stream of people began to walk over from the neighborhood and join us, it just felt like the boundaries, the barriers between the church and the neighborhood, the church and the community, they were just dissolving right before our eyes. You know, the first person to come by was a dad. And he had 2 young sons. He received an invitation on his door that day, showed up to check out what was going on. And so I greeted him, and after making some small talk about our kids and snow cones, I just shared a little bit about what we're doing, about the vision for the neighborhood, including the Co-Gather. And his immediate response was, that's exactly what we need. He talked about how he could already see it as a resource for his small business, for meetings with potential clients. He also talked about it as a safe place for his family, for his kids to go and to hang out. He was genuinely excited. And when later he heard that this was actually the response of a local church, he said, you know what, my wife and I, we'd definitely come over and check that out. That was just the very first interaction we had with the very first neighbor that showed up. And there were so many others. And the responses were overwhelmingly positive. And you know, we're just getting started, because remember that next Sunday, we've invited that same neighborhood to join us once again, this time for lunch. And we've got the In-N-Out truck confirmed for close to 300 hamburgers already, and we can do more. And this is all part of our All-In Sunday, where we're asking our church community to go all in on this vision of the Co-Gather. And so look for more information and an important video from Abigail later this weekend. It should be in your inbox in a day or so. And we are just so excited to take this next important step together. As we prepare for whomever the Spirit draws, let's just continue to bless and eat with and listen to and learn Christ as we seek to simply be present to whatever God's calling us to next. So I look forward to seeing some of you in a branch this weekend, and the rest of you come hungry next Sunday and come ready to be poured out. So until then, grace and peace to you.